professor, board member, author, contributing editor, recipient, winner, finalist, Robert Frost Medalist, Ford Freedom Scholar, Presidential Fellow, Distinguished Writer. Mayor Michael Nutter put it like this: the longtime conscience of the city. Please help me welcome Philadelphia's first Poet Laureate, Sonia Sanchez.
Hello, how are you? It is so good being here. You know, I don't know, I must be doing flashes because I was freezing a minute ago, now I'm hot. So you have to forgive me if I start stripping. I'm only going to go down to my sweater, okay? I promise you. But I've done a lot the last couple of days. And that lot, last night, one of the things is that one of my former students at Temple died. Is it possible to just, yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks. And it's like losing your child when you lose a student, those you who teach. Mm-hmm. You know, it's like one of those things, Yolanda. It's a terrible, terrible thing. And I stood up and someone said, "You seem so stiff." And I kept saying if I began to talk about remembering her when she came into my classroom as a person who just simply didn't know why she was in the university, right? And then years later she ended up as a person who was just an amazing, amazing human being. So I had to sort of look at it in a sense of like I couldn't really talk about all of that. Where she would call me, we got to be friends, and she'd call me and she would say, what's that funny guy who's a detective and is always washing his hands? Monk. She would say, "Monk is on," because I like Monk. But I want to thank the 64th Annual Philadelphia Writers Conference for this invite, and Sister Joanne, Sister Yolanda. I just remember her always, every time I see her now, as, in quotes, as you say, this adult woman with a child, that my mind always goes back to her walking into my office at Temple. This young woman saying that I want to be a writer. And she is a writer, which is always so nice. One of the things I said I'm going to do is I'm going to send, I taught for 40 years, people. So I'm going to send a letter to all my former students and ask them to contribute to the SRF fund, the Sanchez Retirement Fund. I don't know how legal that is, but you know, I might have to research that. Let me begin. When I started to write, I wanted to tell how I had became this woman with razor blades between her teeth. What made me want to pilot others into my bloodstream? What made me rise up to tell my story and finally to learn and tell all of our stories? I guess it must have been something underneath our skirts, women, sisters from Africa, the Caribbean, America, Asia, Latin America, South America, the Middle East, Europe. Something unaccented, accented in our talk and our walk, my sisters. I first started to write after my grandmother died when I was 6 years old. I, child stutterer, who ran with the boys, tasted the wind in my eyes and mouth and swallowed it whole. I wrote privately and secretly for years. This private self became the public self when I discovered all of the pain and rage inside me had a history and herstory. All of the silence had been superimposed on me. I wrote out loud because I had discovered Du Bois's double consciousness. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One even feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideas in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So I wrote, coming to black geography, you, seated like Mansu's cardinal, come up through tongues multiplying memories, and to avoid descent among wounds, cruising like ships climb into these pockets, golden with brine. Because I was born musician to two black braids, I cut a blues song for America. And you, cushioned by middle-class springs, saw ghettos that stretched voices into dust, turned corners where people walked on their faces. I sang unbending songs and gathered gods convenient as Christ. I am the frozen face. Here my face marches towards new mist, while spring runs green with ghosts. I am the living mask. Here my skin warm with adolescence peels like Picasso's plains, and the earth in one fold of permanence stares at the skies. If I had a big piece of dust to ride on, I would gather up my pulse and follow disposable dreams, and all things being equal, they would pass into butterflies and quiver in sprawling yellow. I was born in Birmingham, Alabama. Some people called it Birmingham for years, where many of the black women were mothers and teachers, workers and servants. The men were mostly workers. A few well-trained, conditioned ones were teachers in black schools, or some worked in companies like my grandfather, who worked at the American Cast Iron Pipe Company. As pipes came out, he tagged them with a number. And my grandmother was a domestic, housewife, mother, deaconess in the AME Zion Church. We lived within the shadow of segregation, overt racism, in the shadow of black folk at the mercy of everyone, schools, police, courts of law, federal, state, local government, and all of our experiences were shaped by these various forces. I bring to you this short autobiographical statement because I believe the Caribbean writer George Lamon's definition of culture is quite comprehensive and clear when he says, culture is the means whereby people feed themselves and the ways in which they experience their existence. Ellipsis. A dominant class, exclusively white, laid a foundation of a cultural force that would influence all our lives. It was the ideology of racism, a morality whose guiding light was the aristocracy of the skin. Black, a commodity for cheap labor. White was the symbol and source of authority. In the South of my grandmother and grandfather, father and mother, still a legalized, institutionalized oppression that spoke to the imposed limitation of black folk, separate schools, sitting at the back of the bus, separate churches, separate burial grounds, separate restaurants, separate faces, divided eyes viewing ourselves and the world, and fear was a constant companion for black folk, even if you were a privileged black like my dad, because he was a teacher, musician, nightclub owner, because a competent, relevant education was unavailable to most poor blacks, just as today for most poor people. If you had an education, you were a privileged black, and that made for real social stratification. One of my missions then as a writer, educator, has been to erase the aura of the educated class by cherishing the creative power of learning, a task for the truly creative teacher, writer, preacher, worker, lawyer, judge, mother, father, bus driver, human being. One of my missions has been to celebrate the nodding men and women, the red, black gums, corn cobs smoking, the church-going sisters staring people who were never considered poetic, but we gave them life and form and beauty. And I wrote, Dear Mama, it is Christmas Eve, and the year is passing away with callous feet. My father, your son and I decorate the night with words, sit ceremoniously in human song, watch our blue sapphire words eclipse the night. We have come to this simplicity from afar. He stirs, pulls from his pocket a faded picture of you, black woman, sitting in frigid peace, all of your biography preserved in your face, and my eyes draw up short as he says, her name was Elizabeth, but we used to call her Lizzie. And I hold your picture in my hands, but I know your name by heart, it's Mama. I hold you in my hands and let time pass over my face. Let my baby be. She ain't like the others. She rough. She'll stumble on gentleness later on, oh Mama. Gentleness ain't never been no stranger to my genes, but I did like the roughness of running and swallowing the wind, diving in rivers I could barely swim, jumping from second-story windows into a saving backyard bush. I did love you for loving me so hard, until I slid inside your veins and sailed your blood to an uncrucified shore. And I remember Saturday afternoons at our house, the old sister deaconesses sitting in sacred pain, black cadavers burning with lost aroma, and I crawled behind the couch and listened to breaths I had never breathed, tasted their enormous martyrdom, lives spent on so many things, heard their laughter as Sister Smith's latest performance in church, her purse sailing towards Brother Thomas's head again, and I hugged the laughter round my knees, draped it round my shoulder like a Spanish shawl. And history began once again. I received it and let it circulate in my blood. I learned on those Saturday afternoons about women rooted in themselves, raising themselves in dark America, discharging their pain without ever stopping. I learned about women fighting men back when they hit them. Don't never let no men's hit you more than once, girl. I learned about women's waking their men's up in the night with pans of hot grease, and the compromises reached after the smell of hot grease had penetrated their sleepy brains. I learned about loose women walking their abandoned walk down front in church, crossing their legs instead of their hands to God. And I crept into my eyes alone with my daydreams of being woman, adult, powerful, loving like them, allow nobody to rule me if I didn't want to be. And when they left, when those old bodies had gathered up their sovereign smells after they had kissed and packed up beans snapped and cakes cooked and laughter bagged, after they had called out their last goodbyes, I crawled out of my place, surveyed the room, then walked over to the couch where some had sat for hours and bent my head and smelled their evening smells. I screamed out loud, "Ooh, we ain't that stinky." And I laughed, laughter from 1,000 corridors, and you turned, Mama, closed the door, chased me round the room until I crawled into a corner where your large body could not reach me. But your laughter pierced the little alcove where I sat laughing at the night, and your humming sprinkled my small space, your humming about your Jesus and how one day he was going to take you home. Because you died when I was 6, Mama, I never laughed like that again. Because you died without warning, Mama, my sister and I moved from family to stepmother to friend of the family. I never felt your warmth again. But I knew corners and alcoves and closets where I was pushed when some mad woman went out of control, where I sat for days while some woman raved in rhymes about unwanted children and work and not enough money or love. And I set out my childhood with stutters and poems gathered in my head like some winter storm, and the poems erased the stutters and pain, and the words loved me, and I loved them in return. My first real poem was about you, Mama, and death. My first real poem recited an alphabet of spit, splattering a white bus driver's face after he tried to push cousin Lucille off a bus, and she left Birmingham under the cover of darkness forever. My first real poem is about your Charles White arms holding me up against death. My life flows from your Mama. My style comes from a long line of Louises who picked me up in the night to keep me from wetting the bed. A long line of Sarahs who fed me and my sister and 14 other children from watery soups and beans and a lot of imagination. A long line of Lizzies who made me understand love, sharing, holding a child up to the stars, holding your tribe in a grip of love. A long line of black people holding each other up against silence. I still hear your humming, Mama. The color of your song calls me home. The color of your words saying, let her be. She got a right to be different. She gonna stumble on herself one of these days. Just let the child be, and I be, Mama.